The first time they saw her emerge, she looked like a creature born of the clay itself. Martha straightened her back, a slow, painful unfolding of joints, and pushed a stray strand of mud-caked hair from her face with the back of a filthy wrist. Below her, the small, dusty settlement of Providence shimmered in the late summer heat. A handful of townsfolk had stopped in the street, their conversations trailing off into silence. They stared up at the strange gash she had carved into the base of the hill behind her cabin, a dark mouth gaping in the tawny grass. From that mouth, she had appeared, blinking in the fierce sunlight. Her German shepherd, Luther, sat patiently by the entrance, his coat powdered with the same red dust that covered his mistress. He watched the silent figures below, a low rumble in his chest the only sound breaking the stillness. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose farm sprawled across the most fertile patch of the valley, rested a hand on his wagon wheel and laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Look at that," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "She's digging her own grave," a few men chuckled with him. The women just watched, their faces pinched with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Martha paid them no mind. She picked up the wooden bucket, its side slick with wet earth, and began the slow walk back to the ever-growing mound of dirt beside her small home. They had been watching her for weeks. Ever since she started the digging, right after the last of the spring rains had softened the ground. At first, they thought grief had finally cracked her. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone 2 years, taken by a fever that burned through him in a single, merciless week. She had mourned him with a quiet, fierce stillness that made people uncomfortable. Now, this strange, ceaseless burrowing. "What's she doing, you reckon?" Mr. Finch, the proprietor of the general store, had asked one afternoon, peering over his spectacles at the distant figure on the hillside. "Mole farmer," Abernathy had declared, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That's what she is. Gone feral. Trying to crawl back into the earth that took her husband the name stuck." It was cruel, but it fit the image of the solitary woman, covered in dirt, disappearing into the ground each morning and reappearing only when the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks. She never offered an explanation. When she came to town for salt, flour, or lamp oil, her face was a polite, unreadable mask. She met their stares with a calm that was more unsettling than any outburst. Her silence was a wall, and on the other side of it, she was moving earth, one bucket at a time. The work was a brutal prayer. Each shovelful was a memory of Thomas, his hands, strong and calloused, turning this same soil. He had always respected the land, but he had never trusted it. "The sky gives, and the sky takes," he used to say, looking up at the vast, indifferent blue. But the earth holds. She was holding onto that thought as she dug. The tunnel was just wide enough for her shoulders to pass, and just high enough that she could walk with a slight stoop. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp stone and roots. She had learned the language of the soil, the soft crumble of topsoil, the stubborn resistance of clay, the grating scrape of shovel against hidden rock. Luther would often lie at the entrance, his ears perked, a furry guardian at the gates of her strange kingdom. Sometimes he would venture in, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the packed earth, his cold nose nudging her hand as if to ask if she was all right in the deep dark. She would murmur to him, her voice absorbed by the close walls. "Just a little farther, boy." Almost there, they didn't understand that she wasn't digging a grave. She was digging a promise. A promise to survive the treachery of the sky. The labor was relentless, a rhythm of dig, lift, and carry that consumed her days. She rose before the sun, her muscles screaming in protest, and worked until twilight painted the valley in shades of purple and gray. Her hands, once soft, were now a cartographer's map of hardship, with calloused ridges and a permanent stain of red earth deep in the creases. She devised a simple winch, a rope and pulley system anchored to a sturdy pinyon pine, to haul the larger rocks and heavier loads of clay out of the deepening tunnel. The townsfolk watched the contraption go up with renewed amusement. It was another piece of her madness, a testament to a mind fixated on a pointless, back-breaking task. Inside the hill, her world was expanding. The main tunnel now ran 100 feet deep, straight into the heart of the earth. From this central artery, she began to carve out shallow, wide galleries on either side, like ribs branching from a spine. The design was in her head, a clear and precise image she had sketched on a piece of scrap paper one night by candlelight. It was a farm, hidden from the sun and the frost. In these galleries, she worked the soil, turning it, enriching it with compost she had meticulously saved, creating beds of dark, fertile earth in the perpetual twilight of the tunnels. Her trips to the settlement became more focused. She bought seeds. Not just a few packets, but crates of them. Pumpkin seeds. Winter squash. Varieties known for their hardiness and long keeping. Mr. Finch raised an eyebrow as he tallied the cost. Planning to feed an army, Martha, he asked, a thin smile playing on his lips. Something like that, she replied, her voice even. Her lack of engagement in their gossip only fueled it. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose tongue was the sharpest tool in Providence, swore she was performing some dark ritual in those tunnels. No good can come from turning your back on the sun, she'd pronounce to anyone who would listen, fanning herself on the porch of the general store. It's unnatural. Martha ignored them all. She had found a kind of peace in the rhythmic scrape of her shovel, in the cool, damp air of her subterranean world. The sun-baked surface was where the judgment and the pity lived. Down below, there was only the work. She began transplanting the pumpkin seedlings she had started in small pots behind her cabin. One by one, she carried them into the darkness, placing them gently into the prepared beds. They looked pale and fragile in the lantern light, their leaves a ghostly green. To bring them water, she had spent a week diverting a tiny, hidden spring that trickled from higher up the hill. Using a series of hollowed-out logs, she created a narrow channel that fed a slow, steady drip into a cistern she had carved from the clay. From there, she could water her hidden crop. It was a closed system, a world of her own making, governed not by the chaotic whims of the weather, but by the steady, patient laws of the earth. Luther seemed to understand the sanctity of the place. He would follow her into the galleries and lie down at the end of a row, his head on his paws, watching her work with intelligent, amber eyes. He was her only confidant, the silent witness to her impossible gamble. As summer wore on, the vines began to grow, their tendrils reaching out in the cool darkness, their leaves a deeper green than any that grew under the harsh glare of the sun. She felt a quiet, fierce pride watching them. They were her secret, her shield against the coming cold. She was not a mole. She was a farmer, cultivating hope in the one place no one else had thought to look. The first hint of autumn arrived not as a gentle cooling, but as a sharp, cold breath in the night. The days were still warm, the sun still bright in a sky of polished turquoise, but the mornings now carried a crystalline edge. A thin lace of frost silvered the edges of the water trough when Martha went out at dawn. The other farmers in the valley felt it too. It was a familiar anxiety, a tightening in the gut. The harvest was a race against the first killing frost, a gamble played every year. Abernathy and the others began to work with a feverish intensity, their voices sharp with urgency as they called to their farmhands. They lit smudge pots in their fields at night, thick plumes of smoke rising into the starry sky in a desperate attempt to keep the cold at bay. They covered their most vulnerable plants with burlap sacks and old blankets, dotting the fields with hunched, ghostly shapes. From her hill, Martha watched them. She did nothing to protect the small patch of vegetables she kept in her surface garden. Her corn stalks were yellowing, her few remaining surface squash plants were already showing signs of blight. The people of Providence saw this in action as the final confirmation of her folly. "She's given up," Mrs. Gable announced with grim satisfaction. "That hole in the ground has sucked all the sense right out of her." They saw a woman defeated, a farm neglected. They had no idea that beneath their feet, in the cool, stable temperature of the earth, her true crop was flourishing. The pumpkins in her tunnels were swelling, their skins hardening from a pale green to a deep, vibrant orange. In the steady, unwavering climate of their subterranean home, they were safe from the fickle temper of the sky. The temperature in the tunnels barely fluctuated, holding at a cool, constant 55 degrees, the perfect condition for the slow, steady maturation of winter squash. The air was still and moist, and the plants thrived, their broad leaves forming a dense canopy under the low ceilings of the galleries. Martha would walk among them with her lantern, the soft light glinting off their smooth, round surfaces. The sight filled her with a profound and quiet joy. It was working. Thomas would have understood. He would have seen the simple, elegant logic of it. Using the earth itself as a blanket, a root cellar, a greenhouse, all in one. One evening, the town's preacher, a young, earnest man named Reverend Michael, made the trek up the path to her cabin. He was worried, he said, his face etched with genuine concern. "Martha," he began, twisting his hat in his hands. "The nights are getting colder. The Abernathy farm lost a whole section of beans last night. Is there anything the church can do to help you prepare? We could organize a work party to help with your harvest, what's left of it." Martha looked at his kind, worried face and felt a pang of something other than her usual stoic resolve. He meant well. They all did, in their own way. "Thank you, Reverend," she said, her voice softer than usual. "But I have it under control." He looked past her at the wilting garden, then at the dark, silent mouth of the tunnel. He didn't understand. He couldn't. "If you're sure," he said, his voice trailing off. "I am," she replied. She gave Luther a reassuring pat, and the dog leaned against her leg, a solid, warm presence. As the Reverend walked away, a cold wind swept down from the mountains, rattling the dry leaves on the cottonwood trees. It carried the scent of snow. The race was almost over. And she was the only one who knew she had already won. The frost came like a thief. It did not announce itself with storm clouds or howling winds. It simply descended in the deep, silent hours after midnight, a quiet, glittering blanket of death. When the sun rose, it revealed a world transformed. Every blade of grass, every fence post, every shingled roof was coated in a thick, crystalline layer of white. It was beautiful and terrible. In the valley, a collective groan of despair seemed to rise with the steam from the thawing earth. The fields were a ruin. Abernathy's sprawling pumpkin patch, the pride of the county, was a blackened, nightmarish landscape. The broad leaves were limp and dark, as if they had been boiled. The pumpkins themselves, those that had been on the verge of ripening, now looked bruised and waterlogged, their skins already beginning to soften into rot. The cornstalks stood like brittle skeletons, their leaves withered. The bin fields were a total loss. The smudge pots and blankets had been useless against a cold so deep and so sudden. The work of an entire season, wiped out in a single night. The people of Providence walked through their ruined gardens with a stunned, hollowed-out silence. The hope of a bountiful harvest, the security of a well-stocked larder for the coming winter, had vanished. What they had now was what was already in their cellars, and it was not enough. Not nearly enough to last until the spring thaw. Fear, cold and sharp as the frost itself, began to settle over the town. They looked towards the hills, towards Martha's small, neglected plot. They saw the same devastation there. Her corn was ruined, her surface garden a wreck. A few of the townsfolk felt a grim, uncharitable satisfaction. Her madness had met its predictable end. Others felt a renewed wave of pity for the poor, crazy widow. "Poor woman," Mr. Finch said to a customer, shaking his head. "Lost her mind and her crop all in one go. She won't last the winter alone up there." The name of Mole Farmer was spoken now with less mockery and more sadness, the sad, final label for a woman who had dug a hole in the ground for nothing. Martha, however, felt no despair. She woke that morning, saw the frost-blasted world, and felt a solemn sense of finality. She fed Luther, stoked the fire in her stove, and drank her chicory coffee, all with a deliberate, unhurried calm. Then, she lit her lantern, took her harvesting knife, and walked to the mouth of the tunnel. Inside, nothing had changed. The air was still cool, the earth was still damp. And in the soft, golden glow of her lantern, her hidden fields were a breathtaking sight. The galleries were filled with a bounty of enormous, perfectly formed pumpkins. Their skins were a deep, healthy orange, their stems thick and green. They rested on the dark earth like buried treasure. She ran a hand over the smooth, cool skin of the nearest one. It was firm and heavy. Safe. All of it was safe. She spent the entire day harvesting, her knife making a satisfying thud as she cut the thick stems. She worked with a steady, grateful heart, moving from one pumpkin to the next, her lantern casting a moving circle of light in the darkness. She piled them near the entrance of the main tunnel, a growing mountain of orange gold. It was more than she could ever eat. It was more than her root cellar could ever hold. It was enough. As the sun set on the day of the great frost, casting long, sorrowful shadows over the ruined valley, Martha stood at the entrance to her tunnel, wiping sweat and dirt from her brow. Below, the lights of Providence flickered on, small points of worry in the gathering dusk. They thought she had lost everything. They had no idea she had just saved them all. Weeks turned into a month. The first snows fell, not a gentle dusting, but a heavy, wet blanket that buried the dead fields and turned the world to shades of white and grey. The cold deepened, seeping into the bones of the houses, and with it, the fear in Providence curdled into a quiet, gnawing hunger. The supplies in the general store dwindled. The prices for flour and beans climbed to exorbitant heights. The meager stores in people's root cellars were shrinking with alarming speed. The mood in the town grew grim. Laughter was rare, and the streets were often empty, people hoarding their firewood and their warmth. Martha remained on her hill. She was seen only occasionally, a solitary figure chopping wood or clearing a path to her well, Luther a dark shadow at her side. She didn't come to town. She didn't need to. Her cabin was warm, her larder was full, and the scent of baking pumpkin bread often drifted from her chimney, a tantalizing aroma that drove her hungry neighbors to distraction. They started talking about her again. The pity was gone, replaced by a suspicious, resentful curiosity. How was she surviving so well? What was she eating? The stories about her tunnels, once a source of amusement, now took on a more sinister tone. She was a hoarder. She had a secret stash. The same people who had mocked her now coveted what they imagined she possessed. The breaking point came with Reverend Michael. He arrived at her door one afternoon, his face thin and pale, his eyes full of a weary desperation that hadn't been there before. He looked older than he had just a few weeks ago. "Martha," he said, his voice raspy from the cold. "Forgive my intrusion. But the Abernathy family, their youngest, has taken ill. They have nothing but salted pork left. There is no fruit, no vegetables. The doctor says he needs nourishment." Martha looked at him, her expression unreadable. She had been waiting for this. She knew it was only a matter of time. She nodded slowly, then turned and walked not to her cabin's small pantry, but to the hill. "Come," she said over her shoulder. The Reverend followed, his boots crunching in the snow, a confused look on his face. Luther trotted ahead, leading the way to the tunnel's entrance. Martha pulled aside the heavy canvas flap she had hung to keep out the worst of the wind. She lit the lantern that hung just inside the entrance, its flame chasing the shadows back into the depths. She held it up. The Reverend stepped inside, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. And then he saw it. He gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. The main tunnel was lined on both sides with pumpkins. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They were stacked 3 and 4 high, a great wall of vibrant orange stretching back into the darkness. It was an impossible, miraculous sight. A king's ransom of food, hidden in the earth. "Good Lord," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. He reached out a trembling hand and touched one, as if to confirm it was real. "How?" "The earth holds," Martha said simply. She hefted one of the smaller pumpkins, its weight settling comfortably in her arms. It was a beautiful, 20-pound specimen. "Take this," she said, holding it out to him. And this she picked up another. "Tell them to bake it with a little salt. The seeds can be roasted. It will be good for the boy." Reverend Michael took the pumpkins, his arms trembling under their weight. He stared at her, his eyes shining with a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. "Martha, you saved us." Word spread through Providence like wildfire. The Reverend's story was too incredible to be dismissed. A secret harvest. A mountain of food, hidden in the mole farmer's tunnels. That evening, a slow, hesitant procession of people began to make their way up the snowy path to her cabin. They came with empty sacks and empty stomachs, their faces a mixture of shame, desperation, and hope. The mockery was gone. The ridicule was forgotten. They were no longer coming to stare at the madwoman on the hill. They were coming to beg. The dynamic shifted overnight. The path to Martha's cabin, once overgrown and rarely used, was now a beaten track in the snow. Each day, a small, shuffling line of townspeople formed outside her door. They came with a quiet, humble desperation. Mrs. Gable, her face stripped of its usual haughty expression, asked for a squash to make a soup, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Finch, the storekeeper, offered to trade coffee beans for a few pumpkins, admitting his own family's stores were nearly gone. And then came Abernathy. He stood at her door, his hat in his hands, his face grey with cold and humiliation. The man who had named her mole farmer, who had led the chorus of laughter, could not meet her eyes. "Martha," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the worn planks of her porch. "My wife, the children, we." He didn't need to finish. His shame was a palpable thing in the frigid air. Martha looked at him for a long moment. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of "I told you so," there was only a quiet, weary resolve. She went to the tunnel and returned with 2 of the largest pumpkins from her stores. She placed them at his feet without a word. Abernathy flinched as if she had struck him. He finally looked up, his eyes watery. "I don't have nothing to pay," he rasped. "I'll work it off," he added quickly. "Come spring, I'll give you half my seed stock. I'll plow your field. Anything, just feed your family, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice low. She was not a saint. The distribution was a heavy burden. She was methodical, fair, and firm. She gave enough for a few days, never more, ensuring that her supply would last the winter for everyone. She kept a ledger, marking down who took what, not for payment, but for order. But gratitude is a fragile thing, and as the weeks of dependence wore on, it began to fray. The initial humility of the townspeople started to curdle into a low-grade resentment. Whispers started again. Why was she in charge? Who was she to decide who got how much? It was their food now, wasn't it? They needed it to survive. The look she received grew harder. The quiet thank yous became less frequent. The desperation that had made them humble was now making them bold, and their boldness was turning ugly. She saw them looking past her, their eyes trying to gauge the full extent of her hoard in the tunnel. She started barring her cabin door at night, and Luther took to sleeping on the porch, a low growl rumbling in his chest whenever footsteps approached in the dark. She could feel the pressure building, the weight of their collective hunger pressing in on her. She was no longer just their savior, she was their jailer, the keeper of the key to their survival. The loneliness she had felt before was nothing compared to this. She was surrounded by people who depended on her, yet she had never felt more isolated. The pumpkins, once a source of pride and security, were now a source of danger. They were a beacon in the starving darkness, and she was the one standing in their light. The night the fear became real began with a sound. A splintering crack that was not the frost settling in the wood of the cabin. It was sharp, deliberate, and close. Luther erupted from a deep sleep, a furious volley of barks tearing through the silence. Martha was already out of bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the heaviest tool she kept by the door, a long-handled iron shovel, its edges worn and sharp. She moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. 3 figures, dark shapes against the snowlit landscape, were at the entrance to the tunnel. One of them was prying at the heavy wooden door she had recently built to block the opening. The sound she had heard was the frame beginning to give way. "Get back, Luther," she commanded in a low, firm voice. The dog fell silent but remained at her side, his body coiled like a spring, a menacing growl vibrating in his throat. She unbarred her cabin door and stepped out into the biting cold, the shovel held like a weapon in her hands. "Get away from there," she called out, her voice cutting through the night. The figures froze. They turned, and in the pale moonlight, she could see the desperation on their faces. They were younger men from the edge of town, men whose pride was stronger than their sense of shame. "We just need some food, Martha," one of them said, his voice shaky but defiant. He held up a burlap sack. "We ain't gonna hurt you. Just give us what's fair. What I give you during the day is what's fair," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She took a step forward, and Luther moved with her, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. "This is not the way. Go home." "We can't go home with nothing," the second man shouted, his fear turning to anger. He took a step towards her. "You're sitting on a mountain of it while the rest of us starve." In that moment, the shovel felt impossibly heavy and utterly necessary. This was the moment she had been dreading, when their hunger finally burned away their humanity. She stood her ground, the cold air burning her lungs. She was one woman, with a dog and a shovel, against three desperate men. She thought of Thomas, of the promise she had made to herself to survive. She would not be broken by the sky, and she would not be broken by them. The standoff stretched for a tense, silent minute. The only sounds were the wind whistling around the corner of the cabin and Luther's low, constant growl. The men looked from her unyielding face to the dog's bared teeth, and then back to the shovel. The conviction in their eyes began to waver, replaced by the chilling realization of what they were about to do. Finally, the first man lowered his pry bar. He shook his head, a gesture of defeat and disgust, whether at her or himself, she couldn't tell. "Let's go," he muttered. They backed away slowly, melting back into the darkness from which they came. Martha stood there until their footsteps faded, her body shaking with adrenaline. She leaned on the shovel, her breath coming in ragged clouds. The night was silent again, but the peace was shattered. The lock had been broken. The trust, so carefully managed, was gone. She looked at the damaged door of her tunnel, the source of all her trouble and all her hope. The earth held, but the people were breaking. The news of the attempted theft spread through the town the next morning, carried on whispers of shame and renewed fear. The incident served as a brutal mirror, forcing the people of Providence to see the monsters their hunger was making of them. It was Reverend Michael who acted first. He called a meeting in the church, the one place that was still warm and large enough for everyone. The building was packed, the air thick with tension. Martha was not invited, she remained on her hill, a silent, powerful presence looming over their proceedings. "We have become beggars," the Reverend began, his voice ringing with a pained clarity. "And last night, some among us became thieves. We have taken Martha's foresight, her incredible labor, and we have repaid her with suspicion and threats. We have put a burden on her that no single person should have to bear." He looked out at the faces before him, seeing the shame and the stubborn pride warring in their eyes. "She did not hoard," he continued, his voice rising. "She prepared. While we trusted in a kind sky, she remembered its treachery. She saved herself. And in doing so, she has saved all of us. And what have we done? We have circled her like wolves." A deep, uncomfortable silence filled the church. No one spoke. No one could deny the truth of his words. It was Abernathy who finally broke the silence. He stood up, his tall frame stooped, his face haggard. All the arrogance had been stripped from him, leaving something raw and humbled. "He's right," Abernathy said, his voice rough. I was the first to mock her. I called her a mole farmer," I laughed. "And my family is alive today because I was a fool and she was not." He took a deep breath. "It's not her job to guard that food. It's ours. It's our food now because of her grace, and it's our responsibility to see it shared fairly and kept safe. I'll stand the first watch. Tonight." At the entrance to her tunnels, a murmur went through the crowd. Another man stood up. "I'll stand with you," then another. And another. A plan began to form, a communal decision born from collective shame. They would organize a proper rationing system, run by the Reverend and a council of townsfolk. They would create a roster to guard the tunnels, protecting Martha's creation from their own desperation. They would bring her wood, check on her well, and offer their labor for the food they received. They were taking back the responsibility that they had unfairly thrust upon her. That afternoon, a delegation led by Abernathy and Reverend Michael walked up the hill. Martha watched them approach from her window, her hand resting on Luther's head. She didn't know what to expect. Abernathy stopped a respectful distance from her porch. "Martha," he said, his voice clear and steady. "We've come to relieve you of your post. We're here to guard the tunnels. And to help. We've set up a fair system for the food. You won't be bothered by lines of people anymore. We'll handle it." Martha looked from his face to the others. She saw no resentment, no hidden agenda. She saw only a weary, hard-won sincerity. For the first time in a long time, she felt the crushing weight on her shoulders begin to lift. She gave a single, slow nod. It was all the answer they needed. That night, for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly, the fire in her stove burning low. Outside her window, 2 men from the town stood watch in the cold, their silhouettes stark against the snow, guarding the legacy of the mole farmer. The rest of the winter passed under this new, fragile treaty. The town's system, born of desperation and shame, held. The guards watched over the tunnels in shifts, their presence a constant, visible apology. The food was distributed fairly from a small shed they built near the bottom of the hill, so Martha was no longer disturbed. The arrangement was professional, respectful. She was no longer a provider to be begged from, but a founder to be consulted. Abernathy was true to his word, taking his duty with the grim seriousness of a penitent. He and Martha rarely spoke, but a silent understanding passed between them. He was a man humbled by the earth in a way he had never expected, and she was the woman who had understood its lessons all along. When the spring thaw finally came, melting the snow and revealing the dark, damp soil, it felt like the world was breathing again. The immediate threat of starvation was over. But the memory of the winter, the hunger winter as they would come to call it, had changed them. They could not go back to trusting the sky. On a cool morning in late April, a group of men appeared at Martha's cabin. It was Abernathy, Finch, and several other farmers. They were not carrying empty sacks, they were carrying shovels. "Martha," Abernathy said, getting straight to the point. "We were wondering if you'd be willing to teach us." She looked at the shovels, then at their faces. They were earnest, ready to work. They were not asking for a handout. They were asking for knowledge. She nodded and led them to the hill. She didn't give a speech. She didn't lecture them on their past foolishness. She simply showed them. She showed them how to read the soil, how to brace the tunnels with timber where the earth was soft, how to find the natural contours of the land. She taught them the simple logic of her design. The work began. It was a community effort now. The sound of a single, lonely shovel was replaced by the rhythmic thud and scrape of a dozen. They expanded her network, digging new galleries, creating a vast, subterranean larder that would belong to all of them. They called them the Providence Tunnels. No one ever called her the Mole Farmer again. To them, she was simply Martha, the woman who had listened to the earth when no one else would. She never sought a position of leadership, but she had become the quiet, unshakable center of their new world. She had found her place not by fitting in, but by digging her own. In the evenings, she would sometimes walk to the crest of the hill with Luther and look down at the settlement. She would see the warm lights of the cabins, hear the distant sound of a hammer or a child's laugh. She was still alone, but she was no longer an outcast. Her quiet, stubborn act of survival had become a legacy, an underground promise that had saved them all. The earth held. And now, so did the people.